The prairie wind carried with it the smell of smoke and the sound of silence. A silence too heavy for a land once alive with laughter, songs, and the steady beat of drums. The old American frontier had a way of carving itself into the hearts of those who lived there. It was a place where life was harsh but pure, where the sun burned long hours into the soil. The nights stretched across endless skies filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. It was here, under those same stars, that promises were made and broken, and where one woman had spent 5 years waiting for the return of a man she thought she had lost to time and death. Her eyes scanned the horizon like they had every morning, every dusk, for half a decade. She stood near the cabin that had grown older with her, its wood darkened by rain, and its roof patched with her own hands. The fields beyond had grown wild, reclaiming what she once tried to tame. Seasons had passed over her shoulders like heavy cloaks, each year colder, each harvest leaner, and yet she waited. People in town whispered that she was a ghost of herself, a woman chained to memory, refusing to let go of a dream, but she knew he had not left her completely. She felt his presence in the rustle of leaves, in the crackle of fire, in the way the river never stopped moving forward. She could not bury the bond that had once made her heart fierce and unshakable. He had been more than a man to her. He had been a force of the land itself. An Apache warrior, strong as the mountains and untamed as the desert winds, with eyes that carried both fire and sorrow. I had vanished into war and blood, taken from her by the clash of soldiers and tribes, swallowed by the fury of a world that never wanted them together. She remembered that last night, when the flames of a burning village painted the sky red and his arms pulled her close, whispering words she held like sacred scripture. He had promised to return, though the odds were against him. Promises on the frontier were fragile things like glass in a storm, yet hers had not broken. 5 winters had passed since that night, 5 winters of tending to an empty home, of tracing the edges of his memory, of listening for a horse's hoofbeat that never came. The land grew crueler with every year, pressing her down with loneliness, testing her faith. At times she thought she saw him in the distance, only for the wind to scatter the vision away. Still, she held on, because the heart is stubborn when it loves as deeply as hers. She whispered his name into the firelight, into the soil, into the sky. She believed the earth itself was carrying her prayers to him. Then, on a night when the world seemed to be ending again, when the fire of battle returned to her doorstep, she saw him. The flames were real, consuming a barn at the edge of the homestead, the sky dark with smoke and ash. And in the middle of that blaze stood the figure she had seen 1,000 times in her dreams. Broad shoulders, hair like a raven's wing, scars carved by struggle, eyes filled with storms. He was not a ghost, not a shadow. He was flesh, bone, and breath. The years had aged him, sharpened him, but he was there. The warrior had returned. She did not think her body moved before her mind could. Running through the haze, she fell into his arms with the force of all those years pressing forward at once. His embrace was fierce, his muscles trembling as though the world itself was cracking apart. She pressed her face to his chest, breathing in the scent of sweat and smoke, her tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks. She clung to him like he was the last truth left in her world. "Don't go," she cried, her voice breaking like glass. "I've waited 5 years for you." The words poured from her soul, words she had whispered into the emptiness, night after night. He looked down at her, his face both familiar and changed, as though the land had etched its trials into him. His eyes, dark and deep, met hers with the weight of battles she could not yet understand. He did not speak at first, but the silence between them carried more than words ever could. His hand, rough with scars, brushed her hair back, and in that moment, the years of distance collapsed into nothing. But not all silence is peace. Behind him, beyond the flames, shadows moved. The night was not yet done with them. The sound of hooves thundered across the plains, voices shouting in anger carried on the wind. The world they had known, the world that had kept them apart, was not ready to let them be together. She felt his arms tighten around her, as if he feared she would be torn away again. Her heart pounded with hope and dread all at once. She had him back, But for how long? The land did not forgive easily, and neither did men. The clash that had stolen him from her once was rising again, pressing against the fragile thread of reunion they had just found. The night burned. The air trembled and the future balanced on the edge of a knife. He leaned close, his breath warm, against her ear, as if he might finally tell her why he had returned, what ghost chased him still. But before his words came, before his truth could be spoken, the sound of rifles cracked in the distance, peering through the night like a cruel reminder that nothing was certain on this land. Her fingers dug into his arm, refusing to let go. And as the fire roared higher, the question that haunted her for years returned with sharper teeth. Had fate brought him back to her? Or only given her one last moment before the world took him away again? The crack of rifles rolled across the night air, carried on the wind like thunder tearing through the plains. She felt her body stiffen, her arms locked tighter around the man she had waited for with every heartbeat of the last 5 years. His chest rose and fell against her cheek, steady and calm in a way that only warriors could remain in the face of danger. Yet even in that stillness, she sensed the storm raging beneath his skin. His hand shifted, pulling her closer, protecting her with the strength of a man who had fought too many battles to count. The fire raged behind them, painting the land in red and gold, shadows stretching long as the voices of riders drew nearer. Her breath caught, but he said nothing, only turned his face toward the dark horizon where the threat was coming from. Eyes sharp and alert, reflected the firelight. She had once known those eyes as a place of comfort, a place where her soul could rest, but now they carried the weight of secrets untold. Years apart had changed him. She felt it in the way he held her, as though part of him feared she would vanish if he let go. Yet there was also a distance in his silence, a shadow he had carried back from beyond. The gunfire quieted, but the sound of horses grew louder. He shifted his stance, placing his body between her and the threat, and the warrior instinct rising within him like it had never left. She remembered the first time she had seen that fire in his eyes years ago, when their worlds had collided on this very land. She had been a girl too young to understand the cruelty of the frontier, and he had been a warrior bound to his people, fighting against a tide that wanted to sweep them away. They had met in secrecy, in stolen moments by the river where the cottonwoods grew thick. He had taught her to listen to the land, to hear the voices of the wind and the whispers of the earth. And she had taught him laughter, something soft and rare in a world filled with blood and loss. Their bond had been forged in silence and in fire, a love that neither law nor time could bend. But the war had taken him. Soldiers had come with iron and gunpowder, pushing the Apache farther into the mountains, leaving trails of ashes behind. She had begged him not to go that night, begged him to stay with her, but he had promised to return, his hand pressed against her cheek, his voice low and steady, even as flames lit the horizon. He had walked into the storm, and she had waited through every season, believing that the land itself would return him to her. And now, here he was, flesh and blood again, yet carrying the weight of a journey she could not see. She searched his face in the flickering glow, trying to find the boy she had once loved beneath the scars of a man hardened by years of survival. His silence was louder than the gunfire had been, and her heart trembled with questions that burned against her tongue. Where had he been? What had he seen? Why had he returned now after all this time? But before she could speak, the riders came into view, their figures sharp against the firelit sky. She saw the glint of rifles, the restless shift of horses, and she knew trouble had not finished with them. The leader's voice cut through the night, commanding, angry, filled with the kind of certainty that only men who believed they owned the land carried. The warrior beside her did not flinch, his hand steady as it reached for the knife at his side. He had returned, but the world had not forgiven him. She felt fear crawl into her chest, but it was not for herself. It was for him, for the man who had crossed years and distance to come back to her. The riders called out his name, not with respect, but with accusation, as if his return was an offense to them. She did not know the stories told in her absence, but she knew enough to understand that he was no ordinary man to these people. He carried a history that stretched farther than she could see, battles fought not only with weapons but with spirit. Her hand gripped his arm, urging him to run, but he did not move. His gaze was fixed on the riders, unshaken, as though he had expected this confrontation all along. She realized then that his return had not been chance. The land had not merely carried him back to her out of kindness. He had come because something was unfinished. Some piece of his story had yet to be told. The voices of the riders grew louder, their anger thick in the air. She pressed closer to him, whispering his name, begging him not to go back into the storm that had already stolen so much of their lives. His eyes softened for a brief moment, turning from the horizon to her face, and she saw the man she had loved still alive beneath the warrior's scars. His hand brushed her cheek, gentle, even as danger pressed against them. And for that one heartbeat, she believed they could hold on to this fragile moment forever. But forever was not promised on this land. Not here, where the soil remembered blood and the sky carried smoke. The riders began to move, circling, their rifles raised, their voices harsh with the bitterness of old wars. The warrior tightened his grip around her, his muscles tense, ready for the fight he knew was coming. She could feel his heart beating against her, strong and steady. The rhythm of a man who had faced death before and walked away from it. She wanted to ask him everything. To pull the years from his silence and piece together the life he had lived without her. But there was no time. The night was breaking around them, and the fire consumed the barn in a roar that shook the earth. Sparks danced in the air, floating like fallen stars. And for a moment it felt as if the whole world was burning down. He whispered something then. Words too soft for the riders to hear, but strong enough to cut through her fear. It was not an explanation, not yet, but a promise. A promise that he had not returned only to leave again. Yet even as those words settled in her heart, the crack of another rifle split the air, and the riders spurred their horses forward. The warrior stepped back, pulling her behind him, his body a shield against the storm. She clung to his arm, her tears hot against her skin, torn between the joy of having him and the terror of losing him again. The night held them in its grip, heavy with smoke, fire, and the sound of danger closing in. And just as the riders closed their circle, just as the ground shook with the weight of their charge, the warrior turned his head, his voice low and steady. Speaking the words that would change everything, the riders spread out across the open ground. Their silhouettes stretched by firelight, each figure a shadow of threat and fury. Their voices cut through the night, harsh commands echoing across the plains. Horses pawed at the earth, snorting and restless, sensing the storm of violence about to break loose. She held her breath as the man before her braced himself, his stance unyielding, shoulders squared against the tide of enemies pressing closer. His hand hovered over the knife at his side, and though he had no rifle, no bow, there was a quiet power in the way he stood, as if the land itself had given him strength. She clutched at his arm, whispering his name in desperation, but he did not turn. His gaze was locked on the leader of the riders, a man who carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. The leader's voice carried above the others, sharp with anger, calling out accusations in a tone that spoke of old grievances. She could not understand all the words, but the venom was clear. The warrior had enemies that stretched far beyond this night. Enemies who had not forgotten his past, her heart twisted with fear, but also with questions. What had he done in those lost years? What blood had been spilled in his absence? She had waited with faith and love, but now she realized that his silence was not emptiness, it was heavy with secrets. She could feel the weight of them pressing between them like an invisible wall. The riders closed in tighter, circling like wolves. She felt the urge to run, but there was nowhere to go. The homestead burned behind them, flames climbing high, sending sparks into the sky. The land that had been her shelter was turning to ash before her eyes. And still, she could not let go of him. 5 years had not broken her spirit, and she would not abandon him now, even if the night was destined to end in blood. One of the riders shouted, and the others echoed him, their rifles raised. The warrior's hand tightened around her wrist, pulling her close behind him. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, carrying a calmness that cut through the chaos. He spoke in his tongue, words she had once learned in secret by the riverbank long ago. He told her to trust him, to hold on, and she did, though her body trembled and her chest ached with the weight of fear. The leader of the riders spurred his horse forward a few paces, pointing his rifle directly at the warrior. His words carried like fire through dry grass, accusing him of betrayal, of crimes that had brought death to many. She did not know which parts were truth and which were twisted by hatred. But she saw the flicker of pain in the warrior's eyes, a shadow of memory he did not speak aloud. He did not defend himself with words. He stood in silence, letting the accusations wash over him like rain against stone. For a moment, she wondered if the leader would give the order to fire, to end the night with one command. But the man hesitated, perhaps sensing the fire in the warrior's gaze, the unbroken spirit that no bullet could erase. Instead, the leader barked an order, and the riders began to spread wider, forming a line to cut off escape. The standoff held, but the tension was thick enough to choke. Her mind raced, searching for answers, for a way to break the circle tightening around them. She thought of the small town miles away, where whispers of fear and prejudice lived in every corner. She knew that some folks would call this moment justice, while others would call it vengeance. But to her it was neither. It was the cruel hand of fate tearing at the fragile threads of love she had clung to. The warrior shifted then, speaking at last, his voice deep and carrying across the firelit night. He spoke not in anger, but with the authority of one who had survived more than any man should. His words were a warning, not a plea, reminding the riders that the land did not belong to them, that no matter how many rifles they carried, the earth itself would not bow. The leader sneered, dismissing his words, but the men around him faltered. Some shifted uneasily in their saddles, glancing at one another, unsure. Fear was in their eyes, though they tried to mask it with bluster. She felt hope stir, fragile as glass, but hope all the same. Perhaps the warrior's presence alone would hold them back. Perhaps they would retreat into the night. But even as that thought touched her, the sound of distant voices reached her ears. More riders, approaching fast. The threat was doubling, closing in from beyond the darkness. Her breath caught and her hands tightened on his arm. He did not flinch. Instead, he turned his head just enough to look at her, his gaze softening for a heartbeat. In his eyes, she saw both sorrow and determination, as though he already knew the road ahead would be marked with pain. She wanted to ask him everything then, why he had returned. What ghosts followed him, but there was no time. The first group of riders began shouting again, their words filled with threats. The second group's hoofbeats grew louder, the ground trembling beneath them. She felt the land itself holding its breath, waiting for the clash to erupt. And then, without warning, the warrior moved. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely in the center of the circle, his voice rising louder than the fire, louder than the rifles cocking into place. His words carried conviction, daring the riders to strike if they truly believed they could break him. The force of his presence stopped them for a moment, long enough for silence to fall heavy over the plain. But silence could not last. A rifle fired, the shot echoing into the night. She screamed, clutching at him, but the bullet missed, striking the ground in a shower of dirt. The riders shouted, their horses rearing, chaos breaking loose. The warrior's knife flashed in the firelight as he prepared for the storm that had finally come. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself against the edge of the burning homestead, torn between terror and the unshakable will to stay by his side. The night was unraveling into violence, and she knew there was no stopping it now. Yet even in the midst of the danger, her thoughts reached further into the hidden corners of the past. What had he endured in those lost years? What battles had carved the scars into his flesh, the shadows into his eyes? She remembered the stories told around fires, stories of warriors who vanished into the mountains only to return as legends, carrying the weight of visions and spirits. Had he become one of those? Had he walked the line between the living and the dead? The questions burned in her mind, even as the conflict around them flared brighter. The riders pressed in, rifles cracking, shouts rising, horses screaming into the night. She clung to the thought that he had come back for a reason, that his return was not chance, but destiny. Yet destiny was cruel, and the land gave nothing without cost. The flames rose higher, the smoke choking the stars from the sky. The air was filled with dust, fire, and the cries of men locked in struggle. She could barely see him through the chaos, but she felt his presence unyielding, fighting not only for his life but for hers. And as the night deepened, she realized that this was only the beginning. The conflict was larger than the riders, larger than the fire consuming her home. It was a storm born from years of hatred, from promises broken and debts unpaid. A storm that would not end until everything they loved was tested, until every secret buried in the land was unearthed. She pressed her hand to her chest, praying for strength, for courage, for the will to face what was coming. For even if they survived this night, she knew the battles ahead would demand more than either of them had ever given. The night was alive with fire and fury. Sparks carried high into the sky, mixing with smoke that choked the stars, and the sound of rifles split the air in jagged bursts. Horses screamed as they reared. Men shouted commands that were half lost in the roar of flames, and through it all, he stood at the center like a figure carved from the earth itself. His knife caught the firelight, his stance unshaken even as shadows pressed closer. She could hardly breathe. Pressed against what remained of the cabin wall, her eyes locked on him, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though the sound alone might betray them. The riders circled with deadly patience, their rifles trained, their voices sharp with hatred. She knew their anger was not born only from this night, but from years of conflict. Years of land taken, promises broken, and blood spilled into the soil. Every word hurled at him carried the weight of history. And she realized more than ever that he carried not only his own scars, but the burdens of his people. To them, he was more than a man. He was a symbol, one they wanted erased. He did not flinch beneath their accusations. Though she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his grip on the knife grew firm, his silence was not weakness, but defiance. He had been hunted before, she knew that now, and each time he had survived. Yet something about this night was different. This was not just another battle. This was the storm that had been building for years, pressing closer with every season she had spent waiting. The second group of riders drew nearer, shouts carrying across the burning fields. The ground trembled with the thunder of hooves, and for one breathless moment she thought the earth itself might split. She felt fear crawl like ice through her veins, but beneath it was something else, something stronger. She had waited for him, she had endured the silence, and she would not abandon him now. The leader raised his rifle, his voice cutting through the chaos. He barked orders, demanding surrender, demanding that the warrior give himself up. But surrender had never lived in the warrior's blood. Instead, he took a single step forward, his shadow long against the flames, his voice deep and steady as he spoke in the language of his people. She could not catch every word, but she knew the meaning. It was a vow, a warning, a promise that he would not bow to them, not tonight, not ever. The men shifted uneasily at his defiance, though the leader sneered, his face twisted with hate. Another shot rang out, striking the ground near his feet. She screamed his name, but he stood unmoved, his gaze locked on the riders. For the first time, she saw fear ripple through their line, not the kind born of cowardice, but the kind born of facing a man who had already crossed death and come back. But defiance had its price. More shots erupted, the air splitting with thunder. Horses bolted, smoke thickened, and men charged forward. The warrior moved like a storm, his knife flashing, his body twisting with the fluid strength of years spent in battle. He was outnumbered, but each movement was precise. Each strike a reminder that he was no ordinary man. She could barely see him through the chaos, her vision blurred by smoke and tears. She wanted to run to him, to stand at his side, but her body froze against the wall. All she could do was watch, her heart caught between hope and dread. As the battle unfolded, the riders fought with rage, but their unity began to falter. Some shouted for retreat, others pressed forward with wild fury. The leader's voice rose above them, spurring them on, but doubt had crept into their ranks. She could see it in the way their eyes darted, the way their horses pulled against the reins. The warrior's defiance was cutting deeper than any blade. Yet even as hope flickered, Danger pressed closer. From the darkness beyond the flames, the second group arrived at last, their rifles raised, their horses pounding the earth. The sound alone was enough to shatter her fragile hope. Twice as many now, twice the danger, and still he stood, unyielding. She felt her chest tighten, as though the air itself had grown too heavy to breathe. He turned his head for just a moment, his eyes finding hers through the smoke and fire. In that look, she felt everything he could not say. He was fighting not only for himself but for her, for the years they had lost. For the promise he had made beneath the stars long ago. His gaze steadied her trembling hands, calmed the storm in her chest. Even as the world around them roared with violence, the riders surged again, their circle tightening. Rifles fired, horses screamed, and the night became a blur of firelight and shadows. She clutched at the rough wood of the wall, her fingernails breaking against it, praying silently that he would endure, that the land itself would rise to shield him. But the leader was not done. His voice cut through the night once more, shouting words that made her blood run cold. He was not only after the warrior, he was after her as well. The accusations spilled from his mouth, branding her as a traitor, as someone who had chosen the wrong side of the frontier. The words carried venom, turning not only against him but against her, threatening to tear apart the fragile bond she had clung to for so long. Her knees weakened, her heart slamming in her chest. She had known whispers, cruel words from townsfolk who had called her foolish, who had warned her against loving him. But hearing it shouted in the night, in the midst of fire and gunpowder, cut deeper than she could bear. Yet before she could crumble, his voice rose again, fierce and unshakable. He answered for her, his words a shield as strong as his body. He claimed her as his, as part of his blood, part of his fight. And for a moment, even in the face of death, she felt whole again. The leader's face twisted with rage, and his rifle lifted. She saw the glint of metal, the narrowing of his eyes, and she knew the shot was meant for him. Time slowed, every sound muffled beneath the thunder of her heart. She cried out, rushing forward, though her feet barely moved through the smoke. The shot exploded into the night. She could not see if it had struck, only that chaos erupted once more, men shouting, horses bolting, fire spreading higher. The warrior disappeared into the storm of movement, his shadow lost among the riders. Her cry was swallowed by the night as she searched for him. Desperate to see his face again, the land itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the conflict, as though the soil remembered every drop of blood that had ever soaked into it. The prairie wind carried ash and fear, swirling around her like a cloak she could not remove. She felt herself pulled into the heart of the storm, her body trembling, her mind racing with the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. The riders pressed harder, their circle nearly closed. The flames roared, consuming the last of the homestead, the only shelter she had ever known. She was cornered, with nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Yet even in that desperate moment, she felt the echo of his promise in her heart. He had returned to her once, against all odds, and she believed even now that he would not let the night steal him away again. But the clash had only just begun. The storm was still rising, the air thick with fire and smoke, the shouts of men echoing across the endless plains. And as the leader raised his rifle once more, his eyes burning with vengeance, she knew the moment of reckoning was upon them. The night held its breath. Every sound, every heartbeat, every spark of fire led to this single point. This razor's edge where love, war, and destiny collided, and as she gripped the earth beneath her, her eyes searching for him through the chaos, she realized the climax was not yet here. It was still building higher and higher, the storm gathering its full strength before it would finally break. The night broke open with fire and thunder. The leader's rifle cracked through the roar of flames, the sound splitting the air like lightning. She saw the flash of metal, heard the scream of a horse, and felt the earth shake as men collided in chaos. Her breath caught in her chest as she searched for him, her eyes darting through the smoke and sparks. For a moment, he was gone, swallowed by the storm of bodies and fire. And terror closed around her heart like a fist. Then she saw him again, pushing through the riders with the strength of a man who refused to fall. His knife shone bright in the firelight, his movements swift, unyielding. He was outnumbered, but he fought with the spirit of someone who had walked too long in the shadow of death to ever bow to it again. Each strike was precise, each step forward a defiance of the fate that others tried to write for him. She stumbled closer. Her hands scraped raw against the burning timbers of what once had been her home. Smoke stung her eyes, tears blurring her sight, but she could not stop. She could not stand aside. For 5 years she had waited. For 5 years she had clung to the promise of his return. And she would not let the night steal him again. Her voice cut through the chaos, calling his name, and though he did not look back, she knew he heard. She knew it was her voice that kept him fighting, her voice that tied him to this earth. The leader spurred his horse forward, circling around the flames with cold fury in his eyes. He wanted this to end with blood, not justice. His words rang out again, harsh and bitter, accusing the warrior of crimes, branding her as lost for standing by him. She felt the sting of those words, but she no longer bowed under them. Her heart had chosen, and she would stand in that choice no matter what it cost. The warrior turned as the leader raised his rifle again, their eyes locking across the distance. Time seemed to slow, the fire roaring higher as though the land itself held its breath. He lunged forward, closing the space between them before the shot could be fired. The clash was sudden and violent, the horse rearing, the rifle knocked aside, and the two men locked in struggle at the heart of the storm. She cried out, frozen, as the world spun in a blur of fire and fury. The riders' men hesitated, their unity cracking as fear rippled through their ranks. Some shouted to hold back, others demanded blood, but none dared to intervene. It was as if they, too, felt that this moment belonged to something greater than themselves, a reckoning years in the making. The fight was brutal, each blow shaking the air, but the warrior's strength did not falter. He moved with the memory of battles fought long ago, with the determination of a man who had endured loss and carried it like iron in his bones. Finally, with one last surge, he brought the leader down, the rifle lost, the man sprawled in the dirt. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire and the restless shuffle of horses. For a long moment, no one moved. The riders stared, their faces pale in the glow of flames, caught between loyalty and fear. The warrior stood over the fallen leader, his chest rising and falling, his knife steady, but his eyes calm. He did not strike again. Instead, he lowered the blade and turned his gaze to the men who surrounded them. His voice carried across the silence, firm and unbroken. He spoke of the land, of the blood already spilled, of the futility of more violence. He told them that the soil would not forgive, that the earth remembered every drop shed upon it, and that no rifle could change what was already written in its stones and rivers. The riders shifted, their anger dimming beneath the weight of his words. One by one, their rifles lowered. Their leader groaned in the dirt, defeated but alive, his power broken in the eyes of his men. No one rushed to help him. The storm that had gathered for years began to scatter, its fury draining into the night. She felt her knees weaken as relief washed over her. The battle was not won by death, but by defiance, by the strength of a man who refused to be erased. Slowly, the riders began to retreat, pulling their horses away, their voices low and uncertain. The circle broke, the danger loosening its grip, and the firelight revealed what the darkness had hidden. Two souls still standing when the night itself had tried to tear them apart. She stumbled forward, her body shaking, her tears hot against her face. He turned to her, his eyes finding hers, and for the first time since his return, she saw peace in them. He reached for her, his hand rough but gentle, pulling her against him. She buried her face against his chest, breathing in the truth of him, the solidity of his presence. The fire burned behind them, devouring the homestead, but she no longer mourned what was lost. Homes could be rebuilt, land could be cleared again. What mattered was here in her arms. The promise that had carried her through 5 years of silence had been kept. He had returned, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, but as a man who had chosen to come back, as dawn broke. The riders were gone, the leader carried away, with his pride shattered. The prairie stretched quiet once more, the smoke curling into the morning sky. She sat beside him on the charred earth, their hands still locked together. The weight of the night heavy, but no longer crushing. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe freely, to believe in a tomorrow. He spoke then, softly telling her of the years lost. He had been hunted, captured, escaped into the mountains, where only the wind kept him company. He had seen death too close, walked with it, and yet each time he thought he might not return, he remembered her. It was her face that had led him back from the edge, her voice carried in memory that had given him strength. She listened, tears in her eyes, her hand never leaving his. There were scars in his story, wounds that would never heal fully, but she did not turn away. She accepted them as part of him, as part of the bond they shared. She told him of her own struggles, of the loneliness, of the whispers from town that called her mad for waiting. But she had endured, because love had anchored her as surely as the roots of the old cottonwood by the river, together. They looked to the horizon, where the rising sun painted the land in gold. The past had been cruel, but the future was theirs to shape. They would rebuild, not only a home, but a life, one carved from the ashes of what had been lost. The frontier was harsh, but so was their love, and nothing could break it now. She rested her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, the strength of his presence steady as the mountains. The land was quiet, but it was alive, carrying their story forward in its winds and rivers. The years of waiting were over, silence broken. What remained was not just survival, but renewal, the chance to live fully again. She understood then that the waiting, the suffering, had not been in vain. It had carved them into who they were now, stronger, unshakable, bound together by something that even time and death could not break. And as the sun rose higher, warming their faces, she whispered the words that had lived in her heart for so long. "Don't go. Stay with me now." His hand tightened around hers, his voice low and steady, filled with the weight of truth. "I will never leave again." The land breathed with them, the smoke fading, the fire dying down, leaving only the promise of new life. Their story was no longer one of waiting, but of living, together at last.